interviewing Ann Hendershott, who has written a book, The Politics of Envy, which you can see on the screen there. And it is all about what's going on in today's politically driven climate. And you mentioned in one of your chapters that Trump's election and defeat and what's going on now with Biden and the progressives is reflective of the sin of envy. Can you explain that?
Yes, as a Catholic, I'm very much aware of the seven deadly sins. And I've always been kind of interested in envy because I've sort of noticed it around me. I was a middle child, not that I was an envious child, really. I would never admit to that, but it is a serious sin. I mean, it's so bad that it's one of the commandments. I mean, it's actually mentioned in a couple of the commandments, but the covetousness, that we should not covet what our neighbor has or our neighbor's wife. The idea of envy fascinates me because I see it today, and that's why I wrote the book. I see it in our politics today. I see it in the riots that we're experiencing now in Portland, Seattle, all over the place. People are angry, and they're angry at other people because they think those people have too much. And sometimes there is greed involved. We can't discount the value of greed and the problem of greed. There is such a thing, we know that. But envy is an evil emotion, shouldn't be encouraged. But we have politicians today who are actually encouraging the emotion of envy. Mayor de Blasio, when he was running for the Democratic primary in 2020, he said, there's plenty of wealth in the world. We just need to move it around. It's in the wrong hands. So I'm concerned about that sentiment. And he says he was shaped by liberation theology. Now, I don't know of any liberation theology that would support what he's doing, but I'm not a big fan of liberation theology too. We can get to, there's a whole chapter on that. But de Blasio is the quintessential envious Marxist, I think. He would deny that, of course, but I'm interested in envy.
Well, Ann, let me ask you this. What is the distinction between good old-fashioned greed, which Gordon Gekko and Wall Street says is good, and envy? What's the distinction?
Well, greed is a sin too, a pretty serious sin. And we should certainly not encourage that the way Gordon Gekko did in that great movie. That's a wonderful movie. And there was a celebration of that kind of capitalism, that kind of unfettered capitalism. Nobody's promoting that. But we've completely turned it on its head now in this era of envy, in that anybody who has more is viewed as suspect and viewed as greedy instead of being viewed as someone who worked very hard, perhaps. And we hate people who have a lot. I mean, we're encouraged to hate them. I mean, that the idea of the guillotine that was erected in front of Jeff Bezos' house, the Amazon CEO, by a disgruntled former employee named Mr. Chris Smalls, is emblematic of the culture right now. Everybody cheered that. Everybody thought it was a great idea. I mean, he liked it so much that he brought that guillotine on a tour and took it to wherever he could find rich people. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is also a real proponent of stoking envy. She has a guy who works for her named Dan Riffle, whose Twitter name is Every Billionaire a Policy Failure. So instead of looking at a billionaire as perhaps someone who worked very hard and took risks, because they could have lost everything, that's the idea of capitalism, you can lose everything. Instead of looking at that way, Riffle looks at those people as people who stepped on other people to get what they have.
Well, that's my next question. And that's my next question. You know, playing devil's advocate here. I concede that the politics of envy is a foot in the land and it's very destructive, and people, the demagogues, as you call them, are capitalizing on that to gather votes. But put that aside for a minute. And isn't there some justification for the resentments and the envy when the widespread perception, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, at least in some cases, that it is ill-gotten wealth. It's people that take advantage of political connections, of their money, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like they've earned it necessarily through honest or moral means, but they've taken advantage of where they are with the structure of society and who they know, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, if these are ill-gotten gains and not through old-fashioned hard work, and rugged individualism, if this is because people are taking advantage of special circumstances, is there not a case and a justification for people being resentful and envious?
There's never a case to be resentful and envious. You can be angry at people who have taken advantage of others and people who have indeed stepped on others, or as Elizabeth Warren would say, you didn't build that. But some people really did build that. I mean, the My Pillow guy, he really did build that. And he didn't step on other people and he didn't use special carve outs. And now he's being punished for this, mostly because he supported President Trump. But no, there is no justification for the sin of envy, none.
And how about for those who really have gotten their goods through ill means?
Well, we can dislike them. We can know in our hearts that that will catch up with them eventually. I mean, if you're a Christian, you believe that this all evens out in the end. But to think that you're going to be the judge of whether someone got it through ill-gotten gains and then be envious of them, that hurts you as much as it would hurt them. Envy is really the only emotion, as one writer says, that gives no pleasure at all. The only sin that gives no pleasure at all. I mean, lust, you can have some pleasure. Gluttony, that gives some pleasure. Envy gives no pleasure to anybody. It's no fun at all. It's for anybody. And the person who is the target of your envy hurts as much as you are. Because when you're envious of someone, you're trying to act out on that envy very often. And I have a whole chapter on crimes of envy. People who envy the lovely lives of other people. There's a horrible nanny story in New York City in 2018, where a 55-year-old woman who was working as a nanny from the Dominican Republic, who felt very disenfranchised because she felt her employer was having a life that was too good and she didn't have a good life. So she became so resentful of this woman and her husband and their 3 lovely children that the nanny took care of. This is a 55-year-old nanny, and she'd been with the family for years, and they've been very good to her, even gave her vacations back to the Dominican. This woman became so resentful of the love and the advantages of this family that she murdered 2 of the children. She knew that the mother would come home and find the children, and she was because the mother was picking up the 3rd child at a swim lesson. She walked in the bathroom, and the nanny is proceeding to stab these 2 children to death in front of the mother. And when she was arrested, the nanny said, she had everything, I had nothing.
Right.
That's envy. That's true envy.
Well, let me ask you this. As a devout Catholic, I know you are devout, is there a case to be made that Jesus Christ himself was a socialist?
No. No.
Didn't
Francis would try to convince us.
Didn't the disciples cast aside their worldly goods and devote themselves entirely to the cause? And didn't Christ preach about
The needle and that whole thing? Yeah.
So
they cast aside their goods like Franciscans do. They take a vow of poverty, but they do it by choice. They don't have Mayor de Blasio coming and saying, hey, you got too much. I'm going to take that, okay? Because that's what socialism is. Socialism is about the confiscation of wealth to redistribute it. I'm fine with giving to the poor. We give a lot to the poor, much more than actually President Biden gave most years. We give a lot more than Democrats do. My husband and I, we're very generous to the poor, very generous. Not that I'm bragging. Yeah, I guess I am. It's not even a humble brag, is it? But we do it by choice, and we give to Catholic organizations that we agree with. We try to help the poor. We give to missions. But I would not be, and I'm not happy when I'm forced to give And that's what socialism is about. I don't have a problem with the progressive income tax, even though it is a socialist scheme. And it was when it was first promoted, and I write about it in the book, people said, oh, no, people will never go for this because it's socialism. Well, we accept that now, the progressive. We think that rich people should pay more income tax than poor people. Fine. I'm good with that. But socialism is going the next step. As Dan Riffle, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's aide, he wants to confiscate. He wants to get people to divest from their stock options. He thinks people should have a ceiling of how much they should have, and they should give the rest away. They should take it, not give it away. Yeah.
You know, I find it interesting what you pointed out about the election of 2016 and 2020, that Trump, you know, became the champion of the people, which the Democratic Party used to be when I was a kid.
Right.
Before they were disfranchised by the Democrats, who sold out, I think, to special interests, including Biden leading the charge with China especially. But what I thought interesting, what you pointed out in your book, was that although Trump is a billionaire, at least reputed to be, and you know, lives a privileged life, et cetera, he wasn't corralling the votes of his supporters through envy, but through that they could have more themselves without begrudging the rich. Correct?
Absolutely. And I think that was his appeal. Make America great again was, we can all be great again. I think that's what a lot of people heard, that we all can get better. And the country did get better. I mean, every ethnic, every racial group, Blacks did better, Hispanics did better. The unemployment rate went down for all racial groups. Everybody was being elevated. I mean, it was actually quite a good time for a lot of people.
In contrast to Biden and the progressives, where you know every day whites are being called racist and bigots and everything. Another big thing that Biden has been harping on, which I'm sure you noticed, is that they've replaced the word equality with equity, which means giving perhaps an unfair advantage to the traditionally oppressed. So reverse discrimination in a sense, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. And it's an attempt to equal the outcomes, as if everybody's exactly the same and everybody has equal talents and everybody chooses equal kinds of careers, and we don't. I mean, you know, I am a sociologist, so I study the wage gap. And a lot of people say, oh, women still don't make as much as men. But actually, women do make as much as men if they choose to follow the career path and they don't have children and they don't leave the labor force. So yeah, you can. But equity of outcome is impossible without making it harder for one group to bring one down.
In fact, the old concept of equality was equal opportunity for everyone, but not having everyone placed artificially at the same level, whether they're talented or not, whether they have the same abilities, the same ambition, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I could see this as a real tangent now, what we're going off on, a whole different social trend where equity is replacing equality.
Right, and you know, this isn't new. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson started this with affirmative action, saying that, you know, you can't expect people who've been hobbled by chains to be able to compete in the race. They need to have a head start. And that was the argument for affirmative action. That was 1960s.
Right.
So it seems like the head start continues, and now it's given even more of a head start. I don't know if you heard Biden's talk yesterday, commemorating that horrible massacre it was. But you know,
the Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Yeah, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Just horrible. I mean, I've taught about that. But I also teach about the Italians that were lynched in the South. Some of the widespread lynchings were of Italians. Every ethnic group has been targeted. But today we're really focusing only on Blacks. And they've had a hard time in this country. Certainly, slavery was horrible. But I'm half Italian. I understand that Italians were very much discriminated against and killed because they were Italian. That's the only reason. But nobody wants to talk about that. Why don't they get the Head Start? You know?
Well, also, and back in those days, along with Head Start, there were programs like remedial programs,
Right.
the underperforming students up to more of a higher level. Now they are leveling it to the lowest common denominator. I mean, it's just incredible the direction that this is taken and being justified as social justice.
Yeah, social justice is to me a code for socialism, and it's being embraced by the Catholic Church, especially the Pope we have right now, who really is a liberation theologian. He's elevating all the old discredited liberation theologians of the past, like Gustavo Gutierrez. He invited to the Vatican the first week he was made Pope. He accepted a crucifix in the symbol of a hammer and sickle. For Evo Morales, he's elevated, rehabilitated Leonardo Boff, a Franciscan who was spoken to very sternly. He's brought back into the fold other Jesuits who participated in the Nicaraguan Revolution. I know a lot about that because I taught at the University of San Diego for 15 years. And we were always embracing those Nicaraguan Sandinistas. We used to bring them to camp, not me. I was like the campus Phyllis Schlafly, I think. But the theologians on my campus were all liberation theologians who just loved the liberation theologians, and they brought Commander 2 to campus, who was a participant in the takeover. She dressed as a waiter and held government officials captive at the point of a gun, and she got an award at my school. Now Pope Francis is elevating all those same people again. So here we go again. His latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, I don't know if you've read it or looked at it, but he channels Robespierre. Section 103 of the encyclical uses the motto of the French Revolution: equality, fraternity. I forget what's the third thing of the French Revolution. Hold on, fraternity, equality, and liberty. And he uses the French spelling in the title of his encyclical. Does he not know that?
Well, Anne, doesn't this reflect the drive for socialism and equality to correct all the sins of the past? That's really a reaction to the injustices of the past. And legitimately so, the Pope comes from South America. He lived through that repression. So can't this at least be understood, if not condoned, understood in terms of a reaction to grave injustices that have been suffered for so long by so many of the poor?
Okay, Larry. Yes, you're right. But I'm still not going to forgive him for this. This is crazy, Larry. Of course. But, The Economist calls Pope Francis the Peronist Pope. Michael Savage, I don't know if you know who Michael Savage is, but I've been on his program. He's not as nice as you are, I suppose, but I'm a fan. I'm sorry he's not on as much. He calls him Lenin's Pope. The late Rush Limbaugh called him the Marxist Pope. Our church is being viewed as a Marxist church right now. De Blasio, when he was talking about we need to redistribute, he said, I've been shaped by liberation theology. Now, how could you listen to that and not laugh? Sure, Pope Francis was shaped by Argentina and the corruption there. Nicaragua was corrupt before. I would not side with the corrupt politicians that were keeping the people down, and that helps us understand. But Pope Francis can't be forgiven for bringing back Marxism, I don't think. Especially after Pope St. John Paul II was so worried about liberation theology. He flew to South America, and on the tarmac, he shook his finger at those Jesuits that were carrying rifles and were part of the revolution. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. Okay, go ahead.
That's all right. For those who might not be familiar with the term liberation theology, explain it.
Okay, liberation theology is a theology that really emerges from the people. In fact, they call it the people's church. It's a popular kind of religion. It's part of the church, part of Catholicism, and it's being elevated again in that it views the gospel as providing help through the struggle. They talk about the struggle a lot and social justice a lot, and it supports these uprisings. But Pope St. John Paul, because he came from Poland and he knows that these things end very badly. Very badly. They ended badly for the church in Poland for a very long time. We couldn't have mass, they couldn't have the sacraments. They always end badly. So he was very much against it, but now Pope Francis has rehabilitated it. And we do, as Larry has said, we do have to understand the Peronist Pope, but we can't forgive this, or we can't encourage it like many theologians do. If you take courses on a Jesuit campus, you learn liberation theology as our main theology. A Jesuit magazine, America, I don't know if you read the article last year, Dean Detloff, a graduate student in the Jesuit school, of course, it's a Jesuit magazine. He wrote an article and published it. It was called The Catholic Case for Communism. And the whole article was that the church has to embrace communism. We don't have a choice. That's what the gospel is calling us to do. And that's what liberation theology is. It's really a smokescreen for communism.
That's an interesting point, the contrast between Pope John, who lived through communism, and Pope Francis, who lived through repression, fascist repression. Let me put you on the spot as a devout traditional Catholic. Considering the misgivings you have about Pope Francis, is the Pope, in your mind, still infallible as the church preaches?
On church doctrine, of course.
Doesn't that meld into church doctrine? Liberation?
No, not liberation theology. That's not something that is like the Immaculate Conception or the real presence in the Eucharist. If he starts going down that road, then that would be a problem. But there's very few teachings that are dogmatic church doctrine teachings, but liberation theology isn't one of them. This is just like a distraction, I think. But I think he weakens his authority with a lot of people. I don't know that he's really encouraging vocations to the priesthood, and that's what we need. My last book was Renewal, and it was about all the new vocations we had. And now it's like, whoa, I published it like the year before Pope Francis came in, and there were lots of vocations because under Pope Benedict, it was a church that was becoming revitalized. Now it's a church that's becoming political.
Anne, yeah, I should be calling you Dr. Hendershott.
No, you call me Anne.
But since we've known each other for old time's sake, and considering the decline of Catholicism in America and in the developed industrial states and Western Europe, and considering the growth of Catholicism in South America and in the Asian countries, does that not lend itself with this new population, growing population of Catholics who've been oppressed for so long? Doesn't that lend itself to the reinforcement of liberation theology and socialism?
No, because I don't see the Catholic Church growing in Latin America. It's Africa where the church is really growing. And they're not going to embrace liberation theology. They are the most traditional Catholics. If you've ever had some of the priests that have come here to this country, a lot of the ordinations are coming from Africa. It's the fastest growing part of our church. And that's a very traditional church.
Which surprises me, not knowing that much about it, but considering the history of the African nations being exploited by the West, the colonial period, I would think there would be also residual resentments in those nations as well.
Well, yeah, but the resentment isn't encouraged the way it was in Latin America through the liberation theologians. And they find a certain freedom in the church and help. No, I don't see that liberation theology is going to grow under this Pope.
Under the political correctness that we see and the wokeness and all that, where do you see all this heading?
Well, I have a whole chapter on social media and wokeness and cancel culture. I'm worried about it because envy really flourishes on social media. It's a source of envy and it's a source of resentment. Lots of studies have been done and the chapter is filled with them. But the idea that people, post their experiences and their vacations, those are things that we didn't really see in the past. And research has shown that the more we see of the experiences of others, the more resentful and envious we become. And it makes us very unhappy. Not me, because I have to admit, though, there's other grandmas that post on Facebook. And I used to get really jealous because they were like doing crafts with their grandchildren. And I was like, hey, I don't get to do that. Mine's in Boston and in Florida. Well, now I'm in Florida. So, hey, I'm on Facebook doing crafts. No, I don't try to promote envy, but when we see other people having great experiences, we become very envious and we become anxious. I call this generation anxious generation. My students are so anxious. Will I get a good grade? Am I doing this right? Where you and I, we went to school at a different time. We weren't such worried about our trophies and our grades, and I could care less. I only went to college to find somebody to marry me, but that was a very long time ago, and it worked. And I left college and got married and then went back later. Nobody would think of doing that now because they're all so career minded, and women are so concerned about, getting good grades and getting great jobs. It wears me out. But I think social media has a big part of that. Look at the award I won. Look at the vacation I took. Look at the schools I got into.
Well, in another chapter of your book, you talk about how it all started changing in the 50s and the 60s. The Lonely Crowd was published.
You know that book.
Represented a departure from traditional values into more me first, consumerism, et cetera, correct?
Right. Yeah, you were a sociology major, I think, weren't you, or minor?
Sociology minor, English major. Yeah.
Probably read that book as an undergraduate, David Reisman. It's called The Lonely Crowd, and it lamented the movement from other directed, meaning, from inner directed, meaning caring about your relationship to
right.
family, with God, with yourself, to outer directed, worried more about what other people think of us. And that was a dramatic switch in the 50s and 60s. And it really started in the 50s. And part of it, some people say it had something to do with advertising, perhaps this mass media of advertising, where we would see other people's lives and want that. So envy really kind of was kicked into high gear during that time. And envy is used often in advertising. You'll be the envy of your friends. This car, people will envy you. And that's not a good thing, certainly.
Yeah, it is a departure from traditional values, which some would depict as stodgy now and just not contemporary enough to be able to move effectively in today's society. That would be their perspective. What about the move towards reparations and seeming support from the Biden crew?
Yeah, that's resentment on parade, I think. And in some ways, it almost reminds me of South Africa. Remember those after apartheid was done, and they I think there are some that would like us to have to do something like that. And I don't think encouraging resentment is ever a good idea. Resentment ends badly. I have a whole chapter, crimes of envy, vandalism, arson, rioting. All of that is resentment driven by resentment, and resentment emerges after envy. The word resentment comes from well, there's a French word, resentiment, meaning that you are re-sentiment, re-emotionalizing, reliving the emotion over and over, and it makes you crazy.
Right.
And that ends badly, and it's been bad in South Africa. Things are not great in South Africa. I mean, apartheid was horrible. Nobody wants to say that that was a good thing. But I have a chapter about the Tutsi, and I believe that certainly there were other reasons for the Holocaust, but Nazi Germany was a very envious place because the Jews had very good jobs. They had intact families that were happy and healthy. They were healthier than others. Their wealth was much greater than others. To me, the anti-Asian sentiments that we're seeing on the streets in San Francisco and New York is envy-driven. But that's very unpopular to say. So stop me if you want. But I've written a couple of articles about the anti-Asian hate crimes as envy-driven.
Well, you know, that brings to mind one of the things that I point out now and then about people talking about America being so racist and not everybody has an opportunity. Why do the Asians, by and large, do so well when they come here? I think it's because they come over with a strong family unit. They're determined, and they realize that education is the way to achieve success. Whereas those kinds of values are not present in some of the other minority cultures in this country. What do you take of
No, and that causes resentment. The Asian, if you look at median income, because I'm a sociologist and you are too, Asian median income is 125,000 a year, median income.
Right.
White, non-Hispanic white is 95.
Right.
African American median income is 45,000. That's really, really huge disparity. And is it their fault that they do so well? No, it's all those, as you said, all those tiger moms. I don't know if you read that book, but it's a great book about the battle for the tiger moms. They push their children. Now, some people think, oh, it's too much. But if you want your children to succeed, it's a good idea.
Well, that's how it was with the European immigrants, of which
Yes.
we are a descendant. When they came 2, 3, 4 generations ago, they were hungry. They wanted to assimilate as quickly as possible. That's all out the window today. You know, that they want a salad bowl rather than a melting pot. And this lack of eagerness to assimilate, I think, is very destructive.
It's held them back because if you're not going to learn the language and you're not going to excel in school, but you know, the Italian immigrants, the Irish immigrants, they just, and the Jewish especially, push their kids.
Right.
We would say too much, but no, it helped them. Those kids did well. We all did well.
Yeah. Yeah, and now, you know, our offspring have gotten essentially fat and lazy. You know, they're on their iPads, they're on social media, and they're having a good time. I mean, isn't this kind of a pattern of all successful civilizations, the rise and fall? Rome, I think, is a prime example.
I know.
I think there's a lot of parallels.
Me. I hope not.
A lot of parallels.
The decline is there. You're right. The parallels of the decline. I don't want to say the fall, because I think Americans will wake up. I just do. I think they're not as dumb as they seem right now. I just think they will, because they're already waking up a little bit to the loss of the freedoms, I think.
Well, you know, isn't a large part of it that people are afraid, and with good reason, in most cases, in some cases, to speak out. Fear of social shunning, fear of their job situations, fear of physical reprisals. You know, we see this in the news every other day. So, you know, it's this intimidation that's working for the other side.
It is, and you're courageous to even have me on. Thank you very much. But I have tenure, and I think that people with tenure have an obligation that we can't be fired unless we do something horrible. And I've had tenure in a couple of schools. I've given it up University of San Diego. I had tenure, 15 years. I was chair of the department, and I gave it up, got it. I went to another school, got it, and then another school. I think it's an obligation for those of us who have job security. But even though you have tenure, doesn't mean everyone's going to like you. And there's lots of people who don't like me. And I have a whole chapter about people who have tenure, but who are either faithful Catholics and speaking out about Catholic teachings, pro-life people, people who are against the transgender movement, the craze that's taking over. You speak out about those things, even though you have tenure. Your life can be pretty miserable. I had a friend at Providence College, Anthony Esselin, brilliant teacher, beloved by students, but he spoke out against his university's biased response team, and they made life very difficult for him. There were people outside his office window with megaphones calling him a racist because he was against a biased response team.
Well, and I've always liked you, going back to our grammar school days where we first met. a little personal note there for the audience.
I know, for the listeners, yes.
It was a Catholic grammar school in Waterbury, Connecticut, now part of the Rust Belt, unfortunately, and not nearly the same climate as we grew up under.
We were blessed because we had the best nuns as teachers, wonderful priests, a beautiful new school. I think you were part of the first graduating class.
I was in the first graduating class.
Yeah, but we were there at the same time. And I loved every minute of that school. And I just feel really blessed. I'm sad that other kids don't have that. But there are those kind of pockets still today. Charter schools offer that. Many Catholic schools are still flourishing and providing that kind of loving, but strict. It was strict, you know.
We had a niece. We had a nun there. I won't mention her name, but she was small in stature. Very stern, but with a good heart.
But she liked people who worked hard, so she liked you, I'm sure.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I appreciated her dedication. No, it was a good atmosphere.
I just remember so fondly. So when people talk about, Catholic school days, I just have such pleasant, wonderful memories of Blessed Sacrament School. It's still a school that's going strong, still doing well.
Yeah, and the discipline and the structure, which is frowned upon by some people today. But I mean, kids need discipline and structure. Without it, it becomes chaotic.
It is, yes. I mean, the nuns I remember being in second grade, and Sister Paula Francis invited me to be the angel to lead the first communion class. And that was like the biggest thing in my life, because I had been very envious of other people who'd been chosen before. So when she called me out of class and invited me to be the angel, she said, "Would you like to be the angel?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "Yes, sister." And she said, "Fold your hands." It was like they didn't allow any kind of, emotion. You had to just be very serious. For a second grader who was so excited, she said, "Yes, sister."
So you were among the chosen even back then.
Yes, I was among the chosen.
I hate to bring this back to a serious topic after our fond reminiscence.
Yes.
But getting back to the state of the nation, and actually the state of the world today, they're talking so much now about Marxism openly. Now, for instance, Black Lives Matter, a lot of the people involved in that openly endorse Marxism. I mean, it seems
for everyone else.
Yeah, it seems incredible that this is happening. I think in your book you talk about perhaps it's because of the non-memories of the younger generation, that they don't remember the communism before the wall fell and the Soviet Union fell apart. They don't remember the horrible repression in those days and the results of these socialist nirvanas that didn't turn out to be. Stalin is an example of what happened to Russia, after the peasants were exploited by the aristocracy, they then became subjects of a new type of aristocracy. And but the younger generation is perhaps has a much a brainwashed conception of communism, equating it with social justice.
I know, that's unfortunate. They don't ever, I don't think they learn about the purges. I don't think they learn about the starvation of the Ukrainian peasants.
Yeah,
I don't think kids learn any of that. And that's what's so disturbing. And when you talk about BLM, that is a Marxist organization, but it's run by people who are typical Marxists who feather their nest very well. That Patrice Cullors owns several $1 million homes that she's gotten very rich off BLM.
yeah,
But if we go back to the Sandinistas, when the Sandinistas marched into Managua victorious, the generals and the leaders moved into all the best houses that had been abandoned by the rich. And that's what happens with Marxism. The leaders get very wealthy, and live in palaces,
yeah.
while everybody else starves.
Yeah, I mean, is this trend reversible anytime
I
soon,
worry.
if at all?
I do. It is reversible, but it's going to take massive education. And there are pockets of good colleges. I mean, Grove City, my own Franciscan University, where we teach about the American founding, we teach about the value of capitalism, but not the kind of, I mean, I don't want you to think I'm Gordon Gekko, but capitalism can be a problem too, of course, if they're not controls and restraints. But communism, our church has always taught about the evils of communism. Don't you remember praying for the people living oppressed under communism?
Yeah.
This, don't you remember that? Yeah.
Well, talking about the need for education and hence enlightenment, as a reporter, I am extremely alarmed about the suppression of news. The narratives are being spun now, whereas journalism, it's a whole different stage now. Objective journalism is no longer a goal, no longer endorsed. Even some professors in college, journalism professors, are saying objectivity could be set aside in the interest of social justice. So objectivity is no longer a tenet of basic journalism, and we're already heading, as I see it, towards state media. The only narrative we're getting more and more is what the government approves, and social media is part of that, filtering all that. Case in point was the Hunter Biden laptop story. If you were not watching Fox News or reading the New York Post, you didn't even know about that story. And it was suppressed before the election because it could have damaged Biden. So, that's one of the most egregious examples of it recently, but it's headed in that direction where, the people who call themselves journalists have really become propagandists and cheerleaders. And with that being presented to the public, I think hope is dimming to straighten this out anytime soon. I don't know if you're as pessimistic as I am.
No, I think we're in for a dark period, a long dark period. Even my own students, I have seen them, they view socialism as the kinder, gentler kind of thing.
Right.
And it's hard to try to start from scratch with them, but I do. Yeah, it is. And you would know better than I about journalism. When do you think that turned? When did that happen? Was it Watergate, do you think?
Well, and journalists, I've been a journalist most of my adult life.
I know.
And journalists have always had their favorites. They've always kind of slanted a story or sprinkled it with certain elements that gave favorable treatment to certain favored causes or candidates, but not to the extent it is today. I mean, by and large, back then when I was growing up, there was still a standard of objectivity, even though at times you could see where, perhaps a person's politics really were, but they hid that, and they hid it in the copy that they wrote too, where they present the facts, both sides, and you decide, even if they have those personal opinions. But it started changing. Actually, you may be a fan of Fox News, and I watch it quite a bit too, because despite what is its own spin and slant, it presents stories that you won't see anywhere else,
Oh, I know.
contrary spins. But actually, I think a lot of it started with Fox News when they adapted the niche or niche marketing, where they didn't have to get everybody on board watching them to have a successful network. It was only the conservative element, the people that felt that they were unrepresented, that were resentful, et cetera, et cetera. They captured that audience by being very sensational in many cases and slanted, at least back then. And what happened was, because of the success of Fox News, the other cable networks adapted the same strategy of feeding their audiences, their selective audience, what they wanted to hear. And cable news now is so polluted by that. You can't believe at face value anything they say. You know, it has to be on any of these cable networks. It has to be examined. And then even the regular networks now, ABC, CBS, NBC, they've adapted the same thing, maybe to not such an obvious extent, but I could see the change. And you know, there used to be great national investigative reporters. You don't see that anymore. You know, they investigate what they want to make one candidate look bad or one candidate look good, but there's not a real basic investigative techniques that are used anymore. Again, it's all propaganda. And if that's all the public is exposed to, especially the kids, now we know better because we know how it used to be. But the younger generation, this is what they're growing up with. So they don't even realize the propaganda that they're being exposed to on a daily basis, which is another reason why I'm not too optimistic about where we're headed, at least anytime soon.
Oh, that's too bad. No, that worries me. But I have to agree. I just never thought of it that way, that the others wanted to be like Fox in a way, or capture. That's interesting. I'd never thought of it that way.
Yeah, and now Fox, I mean, I think, you know, despite their own slant, and you know, they go too far at times to try to push a certain version of things, but they do air and expose stories such as the Hunter Biden laptop story that the other networks did not touch, you know, and that shows right there that there's agendas afoot rather than objectivity. So.
I wonder, do you think that will ever come out? Maria Bartiromo really did it on Fox, but the other Fox hosts didn't do much with the Hunter Biden.
I know. So also, I don't know if you caught the time where their own sacred cow, namely George Soros, could not be mentioned. Yeah, they were interviewing Newt Gingrich, and it wasn't Tucker Carlson or Hannity, but some of the other anchors earlier in the day. Gingrich is bringing up how Soros has been funding these key positions, prosecutors and et cetera, that are now in charge of how the law is being unequally applied to those that they're after. And the anchor cut him off and said, no, we don't need to discuss George Soros. So right there, I mean, I don't know what goes on behind the scenes at Fox, if they're all on the same page, or because I know Hannity and Carlson has gone after Soros, but the other anchors, it was not to be discussed.
Interesting.
So
yes, even they have, in the last election, I didn't think they were very helpful, as helpful.
Well, you know, the whole thing about election fraud. Now, they didn't do much with that, and there was so much there. You know, the standard excuse by the other networks was that, well, there have been, you know, 60 cases brought to court. They've all been denied, nothing there.
I know, that's not true.
What they failed to explain was that the evidence was not examined because the cases were rejected by the judges out of hand for lack of standing, being moot, whatever, you know, all kinds of flimsy reasons to dismiss the cases. So the evidence that is there was never examined. And most people don't know that unless they're watching, well, not even Fox News, because they didn't go near it either.
No, they don't want to talk about the election fraud that exists, and they're, I hope, finding in Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I know that you're familiar with Linwood and
Yes,
uh,
Sydney.
Sidney Powell, and they've been on that, but of course they're being discredited. Now they're going after Linwood's his law license, trying to yank that from him. So I don't know how far they'll get. I mean, the evidence is there to be examined. I'm not even saying that there was fraud, but I'm saying there's plenty of evidence that if
Good
you
look.
sift it through,
Yeah.
and analyze before we make a decision on this.
Right.
But you know, there there's so many forces now that work with that one narrative supporting Biden and ilk that are in office in power now, that I don't know if this stuff will ever get out or ever be being examined seriously.
I know, especially because of January 6th.
Yeah,
That's always, we're always reminded of that, the insurrection.
insurrection. Yeah, I mean, yeah. What a misapplication
I
of
know.
that term. And yeah, they're calling it this most serious assault on democracy since the Civil War. You know,
I know.
Biden the
Never
other
mind
day said,
9/11.
Biden the other day said, he said a number of times that white supremacy is the
I
biggest threat
know.
to America, not Al Qaeda, not
I
any of that
know.
stuff.
Yeah, he did that in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, but he does try to gin up resentment, and
yeah.
resentment and envy are twinned there. So
Well, there's a theory that some of my associates subscribe to, that they're purposely ginning this up to push all the buttons to get people to act out violently, and therefore it's even more of a reason to bring in repressive measures. That's one school of thought on this, why they're purposely keeping the division up, because they already won the election by pandering to the special interest groups, to the identity political groups, to the minority groups. As a coalition, they figured they could cast the white vote aside and use up all those others to get them in office, which they did if the election wasn't rigged. But now they're still doing it. And I think that's because, at least some people think, that it's being done intentionally to create enough tension so they could justify more repressive measures.
repressive measure, and that is what happens in any socialist takeover.
Yeah.
You
Which,
create chaos, and people need some guidance, and we'll help you out with our new force here.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which brings me up to another topic. I don't know if you subscribe to any of this or consider a possibility, but years ago it was just dismissed as a conspiracy theory by nutcases. But now there's more and more people, at least that I talk to at times, that say, the new world order is coming. These are the earmarks of the coming imposition of the new world order. Global government where everything is under control of one authority. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think a lot of the talk about no borders, and even Pope Francis talks about no borders, that we have to move.
Right.
That does worry me. Because you don't have a country if you don't have borders.
Right.
We don't have a country anymore. And that's what worries me.
Well, it's already not the country that we grew up in.
Well, that's for sure. Yeah.
On that dire note, we'll wrap it up, this interview up for this time. But
Yes.
I'd love to have you back and
I'd love
discuss.
to come back.
And
I
discuss.
write a lot. I write at American Spectator, so you can find my articles there. American Greatness, I write for. Sometimes in New York Post, I've written for Wall Street Journal. But when I write something interesting, I'll send it to you.
Great, great. And after all these years, it's great to meet up with you again.
Connect. Yes, we won't lose touch this time. I ran a reunion for my class. You should do one. It was so much fun.
We had one, I think, about 30 years ago. I haven't heard from anybody since.
You need to do another one.
Yeah. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I organized it. We had it in a wine bar, and it was so much fun. It was hard to recognize anyone because, from 8th grade, they've changed a bit.
And I'm sure all our listeners out there, have their own reunions that they might like to attend and catch up with old friends. I mean, we're an amazing example here. We haven't seen each other for what, 60 years?
I guess. Yeah.
We're aging ourselves, or at least I'm
I
aging
know,
myself.
60 years.
And here we are, yeah, so many
I
years.
know. But we have a lot in common. We both loved Waterbury.
We do. Waterbury, Connecticut. That's a topic for another day, and how
I
that's
know.
emblematic of the changes.
Decline and fall of Waterbury. Still a good place, though. There's still good people there.
Yeah.
Really wonderful people.
Really is. And Hendershott, thanks very much for being with us, and we will
Thank you.
be talking again.
I hope so. Thanks, Larry. Bye-bye.
Bye now.